Good morning and good afternoon to everybody on our webinar today. We are excited to present to you Heartbleed and Other Breaches. The Beat Goes On, Content, Debunking, Current Approaches, and a Way Forward. Presented by Andre Boysen from SecureKey. I'd like to introduce you to Andre Boysen. He is our EVP of Marketing. He is responsible for positioning SecureKey's growth strategy, cultivating opportunities in new and existing markets, and promoting demand for the company's solutions globally. He serves as SecureKey's digital identity evangelist, and we're excited to have him present today. Over to you, Andre.
Sarah, thanks so much, and thanks everybody for coming today. I appreciate you putting the time in. What I wanted to do today is just talk about something that's on everybody's minds in the newspaper. We're seeing breach after breach on the internet, and so I just want to try and put those into context, kind of talk about some root causes, and then talk about what we might be able to do to solve it. So when you think about it, the newspaper is full of stories from these great companies, and they all have very compelling products to offer. In fact, I've bought services from most of these companies on the screen, and they all have a very large customer following. So they've all been very, very successful in delivering services both in the store and online. One of the challenges, though, is they all suffer from a common problem, and it's not unique to them alone. It's a problem that kind of haunts the whole internet, and it's this problem of password breaches. So here we have a cool slide. I got this from Information is Beautiful, and it kind of just lays out visually how big these attacks actually are. And so one of the most recent ones in the news, eBay and Target, both had very, very large-scale breaches. In the case of eBay, 145 million user accounts were compromised. In the case of Target, it was up to 70 million. But those are just the most recent ones. If you go back in time, you've got Adobe, Evernote, Apple. All these very, very large companies are getting hacked, and what the consequence of user information is getting leaked out all over the internet. And so that's causing problems for those businesses to recover, and it causes actually more concern to each of us as individual users of the internet. So I don't think these companies are necessarily doing it any more poorly than anybody else. I think they've just been easier targets maybe in some respects. The crooks managed to find that one weak spot in the fence and get through. And so what I want to do is kind of talk about what is the problem. So this is the password architecture for pretty much every website on the internet. And this is kind of how it works. You're on your browser on your computer at home over on the left. And you type your URL for the website you want to go to into the browser. And then having done that, it'll prompt you for a user ID and password, and so you do that. At this stage, what happens is although the web browser kind of X's out your password, what happens is your password shipped over the internet to your destination website. And then your website does something called hashing, which I'll explain in a moment. And this hash of your password is compared to one that's in a database. And this is where the problem is. So I'm going to talk about two problems here and then explain what's going on. So the first thing I want to do is just for those who don't understand what hashing is, kind of how it works. So hashing is a one-way function. It allows you to take any input and create a unique output, but you can't recreate the output, use the output to recreate the input. So said another way, I can use a pig to create sausages, but I can't use a sausage to create a pig. So it's a one-way function. And so what's happening is that your password is when it reaches the website, they hash it, and they compare it to the original password. So if the two hashes match, they know it's the correct password. Well, it turns out that you have a big database essentially with all the passwords here, and it's basically honeypot, and that's what's happened to all of these web services. The crooks have found a way into the hash word of all these passwords for these web services, and that's the essential problem of what's going on. Is we have these big honeypots of data that sit on these web services, and if they get breached, basically all of the user data leaks out. And while we're focusing on passwords today, this also applies to your name and your address and your credit card info as well. So that's kind of the problem. We've got to find a way to address this password problem, both shipping it over the internet and also having it stored in databases. So in addition to the problem I just talked about, one that doesn't show up in the news very much is what users are doing on their side. So users are typically accessing many, many services, not just one. In my own personal instance, I actually have 300 user IDs and passwords. And so users have developed their own coping mechanisms to deal with these long lists of passwords. And so some people save their passwords in the browsers that they use. Some people have Excel spreadsheets. Some people use like password managers like LastPass or Dashlane. Many users cope by copying. They actually share user IDs and passwords across sites. Some people use a technique called scorched earth, which they purposely set a password they'll never remember, and they just use the knowledge-based questions to recover every single time. Some people use paper lists, and some people use sticky notes. So the challenge is that all of these actually pose a risk as well, because it's another way for user passwords to leak out and then provide a way in for unauthorized access. So this is another thing we kind of need to solve for. So here's the bitter irony of passwords, and it's never really become clear until I kind of saw this cartoon. So you go through all the trouble of making a crazy, very, very hard password. And so you're going to put numbers and characters in it, punctuation, all the good internet hygiene rules you apply to your password. Here's the thing, is that a given web server can actually be programmed to attack your password at a website. If they do 1,000 guesses a day for 3 days, they can basically find out what your password is just by repetitively going through every single character stroke that they need to do. So it's just a very, very simple programming problem that you can break into anybody's user ID and password in 3 days. But the problem is, from a user point of view, if you do something like Troubadour with a symbol and the numbers and all that kind of stuff, you can't remember it. And so this is the problem we've got today, is that passwords are hard for users and easy for crooks. And here's an astonishing fact that I got from Dashlane. Dashlane is a password manager site, and they just produced an infographic, which is kind of cool. They said 51% of the websites that they service, and these are the top 100 websites that you would, all the name brands, 51% of them allow password bashing. So they allow this server attack that I just described here on the screen. So clearly this password thing is a problem, for, both for users and from a web service point of view in keeping data safe. So I want to bring it to Heartbleed for a second. So Heartbleed was different than those other breaches that I've just talked about. Those other breaches were all focused attacks on a single site. Heartbleed was very different than these other breaches in that it was a horizontal attack of the internet. Every single web service basically was affected in some way. So before I get into the Heartbleed details, I just want to explain what SSL is. So SSL stands for Secure Sockets Layer, and what it is effectively the private tunnel between you and a web service. So if you ever saw Get Smart, it's kind of like the cone of silence. So you have a private dedicated channel for two parties to talk, and that's really what SSL does. Well, in the case of Heartbleed, what happened is that an SSL layer was compromised, and 2/3 of the websites on the internet were using this affected version that basically allowed all of your password information, instead of being kept secret, was done in the clear. So here's another problem with this password architecture, is even when the user does everything right and they have good internet hygiene, the challenge is that there's other vulnerabilities that they're still open to, which is, as we see here with Heartbleed. So Heartbleed kind of pounds home this problem, that the first thing is we need to understand that passwords are static, shared secret. Static means they don't change very often, and that poses a risk. The other challenge we see with Heartbleed is shipping passwords over the internet can be a risk as well, because now we have to make sure that all of the intermediary points are well managed too. Another thing that Heartbleed kind of points out in stark relief is that authentication everywhere is a bad idea. Every single web service on the planet today is in the business of doing authentication. The challenge is that some sites do it well and some sites don't do it well. And because users have this habit of sharing their sites passwords across sites, what happens is that when Site B gets hacked because they had weak authentication, Site A, which has strong authentication, also has a vulnerability because the user made the password the same. And so that kind of leads us to this very, very strong conclusion that secrets aren't enough. We can't protect the internet with secrets. Your data is not safe based on having passwords. And the related item is the way we recover from lost passwords is typically knowledge-based questions and knowledge-based answers, or KBAs, it's known. It's kind of insane that I would go through all of the trouble of making 300 unique, very, very hard and very long passwords, yet all of the recovery questions are the exact same. So the other secondary conclusion here is they can't really protect secrets with more secrets. So we've got to get beyond secrets is kind of the message here. So this just depicts in a little more detail the Heartbleed vulnerability. So what was happening is, back to our password diagram, as you can see here on the screen, is that the tunnel gets wrapped around your password. So that's a piece of software that runs between your web browser and the web destination you're trying to reach. And the challenge with Heartbleed is that thing was actually, rather than keeping your password secret and encrypted from outside eyes, was actually allowing it to be seen by anybody. It's a little bit worse than that. In fact, it was if you kicked the server just right, it would actually kick out all the secrets that it had in memory too, including the keys to the server. And so there was many follow-on effects from Heartbleed other than just this loss of passwords. So that's the conclusion that we kind of reach, is that with static passwords, we've got two big problems. The first problem is related to passwords in motion, the idea of shipping passwords over the internet. What we see from the previous diagram and from some of these attacks is that there's all sorts of attacks that are mountable either in the browser or in the network, and where your password can be intercepted. So even when the user does everything right, they're still vulnerable. So that's a problem. The second problem, as we saw at the beginning of the presentation, is that passwords at rest, password databases, are also a big risk. The additional problem with passwords is that there's no method of detecting if a breach has happened. So if someone knows your password, you don't know that they know your password, so that's a problem. And the secondary problem is there's no smoking gun pointing to the fact you've been exploited either. You may find out after the fact and have to do some sort of recovery. So if your information got exposed, or maybe there's a rogue charge on your credit card, you have to do some work there, but there's no mechanism to allow you to detect that this has happened and find out where it happened. And then we have this additional problem with users having lots and lots of passwords and sharing them across sites. There's risk propagation. When one site gets hacked, many sites get hacked because users typically share their passwords across sites. So here's the interesting thing, is that we kind of see that passwords are an issue. And so in a lot of ways, what's been done to address this is what's called 2FA, or two-factor authentication, out-of-band authentication, or kind of the coping or balancing mechanisms to try to make authentication stronger. And so, one place the mind races to when you hear about these password problems is, well, we just got to put out 2FA everywhere. And on some level, that is part of the answer, but just not the way that it's currently rolling out. So let me just explain what I mean here. I've, because of the business I've in, I've actually turned on to all this second factor stuff because I'm trying to keep my information safe. And so every web service I have in my life is trying to do this a little bit different. So, with Facebook and Twitter and sites like this, they use SMS. So they like to send me an SMS message on my phone. And then I've got Google and Evernote. They have this app on my phone called Google Authenticator. And whenever I want to get into them, I got to go into the secondary app, grab a number out of that thing, and go back to my first site and pop that thing in. And then I've got sites like LastPass, and then LastPass has another app on my phone called Twofer. And so when I want to get into my LastPass accounts on a new device, I actually have to go over to this app and say, yep, I really want to get in. And then I've got my PayPal account, and with PayPal account, I've got a USB token that I actually physically stick in my computer when I want to get access. And I signed up for a new web service last night, and what they want me to do is look in the camera and say boo. And so the challenge from a user point of view is I've got every web service in my life trying to make up a different way to get me in. And from a user point of view, there's the first problem, which is having all these goofy authentication doodads that I've got to configure and manage. That's one problem. The second thing is I got to remember how to do all these new tricks they're trying to teach me. And so we really don't think this is a great way forward. Like, I am not going to configure 300 authenticators to all the websites I want to go to. So there's going to be a rationalization of this at some point, and we can talk about that another day. But one thing we've got to do is kind of standardize how this is going to happen. So here's some of the answers that are in the marketplace today. The first thing to understand is that all of the second factor or 2FA solutions out there that have been kind of developed to date anyway have been focused on the enterprise. So they're meant for a corporation trying to control access to resources and to make sure only their authorized employees and agents get access to the data. So we've seen things like USB tokens, apps on phones, and all these kind of stuff. And they work okay inside the enterprise, but trying to carry around 300 USB tokens is not really going to be an answer. The second thing is they're not really thought of or designed with the consumer in mind. So these are, my dad and my wife. I've got them trying to do this second factor stuff because I'm trying to make them safe, and they're fighting me on it. They're just saying this is too hard and too complex, and I don't want to do it. And so we've got to get to a simpler way for users. The secondary challenge with these solutions is they're kind of meant for, being inside the being connected directly to the enterprise. So they don't work well for web. They certainly don't work well on mobile, and they don't help in the call center. And so second factor then is not really designed to solve consumer service issues. Here's another related item to SMS as a mechanism for doing out-of-band authentication, as it's called, is that there was an attack that was running in Europe called Eurograbber, and this is kind of the way it worked. If you are banking on a website and you'd inadvertently downloaded a Trojan, so this Trojan's sitting on your computer, what they would do the next time you accessed your bank is they would, in your banking sessions, put up a message, hey, you're banking with the bank X needs to be more secure, so we're going to just gather a bit of information and then send an SMS to your phone so your phone could be part of your security solution. And so then the users, thinking this is coming from their bank, says sure, and then so they get an SMS on their phone from not the bank but from the malware, and the malware basically installs a Trojan now on their phone. And now when the bank goes to do an SMS to the user, say, do you really want to transfer this money, the software on the phone intercepts it and redirects, takes the code and redirects it to say, yeah, I want to transfer $100,000 to the crook. And so users were getting hurt by this in the order from 500 to 250,000 euros at a time. And the total scope and scale of this Eurograbber attack was 36 million euros were taken from 30,000 customers from over 30 banks. So it was a very, very widespread attack. So despite the fact that OTPs or one-time passwords can be strong, they can be intercepted. And so we've got to do something better here. And so that's kind of, what we're seeing is that, today all the devices that we're trying to throw at the problem for solving for passwords aren't really solving the problem either. And so we need to do something better here. So we're, trying to add hardcore, really big-scale security solutions to consumer solutions is not really going to work. We need a better method. And so passwords, we kind of realize are unfixable. And worse than that, they're easy for crooks and hard for users. Enterprise 2FA has problems on its own right, but we certainly see that it's not well suited for consumers to use, particularly when users are trying to get to 300 different websites. So it's hard for users. They're hassle to carry around, and if I lose my special purpose token for my website, recovery is a real issue, particularly for a website that doesn't have a phone number. So the last thing we kind of see is that one of the problems with the internet architecture today is it requires the users to be smart for the solution to be effective. And that's just not good design. We need a mechanism that keeps users safe where they don't actually have to be in all the nitty-bitty grits of how the security solution actually works. And so we need that kind of model. And so before I get to that, I just want to draw your eye to this very interesting observation. So Facebook is in the password paradigm. And they have access to nothing I really care about, and they have all the crazy password rules. So for my Facebook site, I have an 8-character password, and on my mobile, that's 12+ characters. By contrast, my bank card, which has access to all my money, only has a 4-digit PIN. And you're probably terrified right now about your money, and it makes you wonder, is this a security paradox? But the truth is that the reason the bank can have a 4-digit PIN is because the security is not anchored in the 4-digit PIN. It's anchored in the card you carry around. And so that's a good example of how it can hide security complexity from users. So what we know about the user is that if they lose their bank card, they'll call up their bank in a few minutes in a panic, say, I lost my card. And when they do that, what happens is the bank will disable the card, and so it ceases to be useful in the hands of the person who found it. And then the user can get a new card and continue on with the 4-digit PIN. And so that's kind of the observation here, is if we can start anchoring the internet in stuff instead of in secrets, we can actually make the user's life that much better, and also keep the security very, very strong. And so that's kind of leading or pointing towards an answer, is that payment systems kind of guard all the money in the world, and they actually do it quite well. And so what that leads us to understand is how do they do that? So the first thing that bank cards do, ones that have chips inside them, not magstripe cards, but chip cards, is they have dynamic authentication. And so what that means is that every time the user uses a card, it's new and unique proof it's really them. There's some cryptography inside the card that sends a challenge response mechanism to the card to have the card prove it was the same one the user was originally issued to. The other thing that's unique about these cards is they can't be copied. It's like DNA. And so there's only going to be one card of that kind on the planet. And so that provides a very, very strong security anchor for the banks to have trust that it's really the user on the end of the line, that the card is there and then they know the PIN and the user didn't report it stolen. And so if we can take that kind of thinking and now start applying it to web services, we can actually start saying, well, maybe we can start anchoring this in devices that users always carry. So we can put some special security software in these devices that users buy at the store, then the users can bring them home and pair them with their web service, and we can start doing the same kind of thing for web services that we can do with payment cards. And that's kind of the thinking, I think, that needs to be applied to make the web experience both safer and easier for users. And so what we need is something that's going to be easy to use, easy to deploy, and that's going to really take the game up on security. So how might this work? Well, the most important thing to understand is with dynamic authentication, 3 problems are gone. So there's no shared secrets, so there's no passwords. We're not, as a consequence, we're not shipping passwords around the internet over, SSL tunnels that are meant to be encrypted, may or may not be encrypted. And there's certainly no password database, so there's no honeypot of data for the hackers to go after. This is what the notion of dynamic authentication is all about. So, like a payment card, the security technique for doing this is something called a cryptogram, which is basically a cryptographic message that only this card, or in this case, this web browser can produce. And so every time you want to access a service, we can do 2 things. We can actually prove the device that the user enrolled with is here right now, and because it hasn't been reported stolen or missing, that it's still a valid authentication token. And with a 4-digit PIN on the phone, we can actually release and produce this cryptogram saying that the user actually wants to do a transaction. And so by doing this, we actually eliminate several problems. Users don't have to remember long, hairy passwords. They can have a 4-digit PIN like they do on their bank card. And there's no honeypot of data at the other side for the hackers to go after, and there's nothing to grab in the middle. And most importantly, unlike OTPs, there's a mutual authentication. So the server knows it's the user, and more importantly, the user's device knows it's really the server. And so intercepts, either in the browser or in the middle in the network, aren't possible. And that's kind of what we think needs to happen if we're going to make web services both safer and for users to use and easier. And so this kind of lays the groundwork for a bigger concept that we're working on, and this is where we think the industry is going, is the concept of digital IDs. So rather than user IDs and passwords, we can get trustable statements that users can present when they want to access online services. And so, well, like the credit card model, you would have, somebody you trust that you want to have be your trusted provider when you go to places on the internet. And then users can anchor this in devices they bought in the store. So like I can go to the store and buy a phone and pair it with my car, I'll be able to go to the store and buy a device and pair it with my web service. And by doing this kind of technique, we can also make it work across channels. So with my bank as an example, rather than having a unique access mechanism for the phone and the branch and on mobile, I can actually make those experiences the same. And so by doing this, we can actually hide all the security complexity from the user, and so we can actually deliver more meaningful experience because we can have higher trust the user is really there, and also there's less friction for the users, so they're more likely to be successful in trying to accomplish their online task. And so the question then becomes, okay, well, if we're going to anchor stuff on consumer devices, how on earth are we going to do that? Well, the first thing you got to recognize is that there's a whole bunch of different user devices that are out there. So we have PCs, tablets, and mobile devices, and in some cases we even have cards. So we've got to be able to use things that users already have and use those as anchors for the services that people want to get access to. So we as a company, as an example, believe that secure elements, which are things that you find in phones and also in cards, are good devices. Trusted execution environments, which are occurring more and more. Mobile devices are important. We're partnered with Intel to have our security stack embedded in every single laptop that they ship, so that's another good example of where we can actually lock down 350 million devices today in market based on devices consumers bought in the store. And an optional element of the story is that we can actually add an NFC so that users can do enrollment from home. One kind of binding mechanism I could, and we could envisage is that if I want to tell the bank I got a new laptop as part of my experience, I could actually go to the store and buy a new laptop, bring it home. And if I want to say to the bank, this is my laptop, what I can do is tap my bank card on my laptop so the bank can see my card is there, and I would enter a PIN to go with that, and now I can do a secure pairing of my laptop with my bank service as an example. So this is kind of how it's going to happen, is that we're going to start getting anchored in real hardware, much the way the payment system is anchored in real cards. But we can address all in-market devices, all PCs, and all tablets and all smartphones today with a virtual secure element. So we can do in software much what we're talking about in hardware here, and much better than anything that people can do today with just simpler techniques, which I'll get into in a few minutes. So I talked about this a little bit, but this is kind of key. So if we're really going to solve this authentication problem, we don't want to just solve it for web. We don't want to just solve it for mobile. We kind of got to bring the experience together for user. One of the things that kind of drives me crazy whenever I call my bank is I'll dial the 10-digit number for the bank. I do that. Then they proceed to ask me for my 16-digit client code. So I type that in my phone. And then I have a special purpose 3-digit PIN that I use at the call center. So I type that in. And then I get a silicon menu, so I go to the silicon menu and say, I actually want to talk to somebody. And for whatever reason, the call center agent doesn't recognize or appreciate what I've just done, and so they proceed to ask me for my client card again. And then they'll ask me 20 minutes of stupid questions like, what was the last thing I purchased on my card, or what's my address, or what's my mother's maiden name? And this is just a crazy authentication mechanism. So if we can get to a solution where we've got software anchored in trusted devices, one of the things we can do is actually push an authentication event from the phone to the call center agent, and they can see that it's really Andre Boyson on the phone because the phone he registered with the bank is really there. So this is kind of how we're going to get beyond this kind of bespoke or kind of channel-specific authentication that we're, as consumers, experiencing everywhere in our life. And so this is kind of, this is more than multi-factor authentication, but this is multi-factor authentication done right. It has many places that the user can actually use it. And so this is not an enterprise model. This is more of a consumer model of how we're going to make MFA work. So how does this stack up then against other techniques in markets? So in the lower left, you kind of see usernames and passwords are kind of the weakest. They're not very strong. And they're not very scalable either because they present all sorts of security risks. Knowledge-based answers also aren't very strong. We can have tokens with one-time passwords on them. They're okay. They're better. SMS on phone has its weaknesses. We talked about that a little bit already. I can put an app in the phone. That's another mechanism. We can stick a USB in a computer. That's another mechanism. These are all kind of enterprise-oriented thoughts about how consumers are going to get access to devices, though. So if we can start getting to strong device fingerprinting and things like the quick code, which I talked about, or even as we see with Apple yesterday and Samsung already and Google, we can use a simple fingerprint on a phone as a mechanism to unlock access to things. Those two things together are quite strong. They function like a payment card in terms of authentication strength. We can get to a much better model that's much more scalable for users, and this is really where we think the market needs to go. We need to have this dynamic authentication so that every access from the user is a unique proof that it's them. We need to anchor it in devices that consumers already have rather than trying to give them new stuff. And then we want to make sure that you can layer this in to things that your services are doing already. So this is just kind of one layer in many layers that the bank will use to authenticate you. But as a front line, it's very, very strong. And so that's kind of what the FIDO Alliance is about, and we're a member of the FIDO Alliance. It kind of says that, users are going to buy devices in the store, and much like I can pair my phone with my car through Bluetooth, I'm going to be able to pair my device with my web service using FIDO. And so we do think this is the right model and how this problem needs to be addressed. And so kind of wrapping up and concluding on these thoughts, the idea here is that, passwords are clearly not the answer, and it's mostly not a password problem per se. It's the password architecture when this honeypot of data in the form of password databases that needs to be fixed. The current model of trying to roll 2FA out to every website in the world isn't going to work very well either. And so what we think is that payment networks have a lot of lessons learned and a lot of good proof points of how we can make web services better. And so the idea here is that, as we've talked about, is we're going to start anchoring the user's experience in devices they've bought in the store, and allow them to express, how they want to be served. So if I, as an example, I have 2 devices with my bank, and the new iPhone comes out, I can go to my bank and say, hey, the Android I have there, I don't want to use that anymore. I want to use this new iPhone. And so users got to be able to have control over which devices they want to use to reach their web services. And then the second thing we need to do is to bring the user experiences together across all the channels we're trying to serve on. And so that's the idea of bringing web, mobile, and call center all together. And so that's it for my formal remarks, but I did want to leave lots of time for questions and answers because I suspect there'll be some. So we have allocated lots of time for questions on the phone. So I'm going to hand it back to Sarah, and we're going to listen to some of the questions that people have from the audience.
Great, thanks, Andre. So the first question I have here is, does every website have to deploy two-factor authentication?
Do they have to? And the current model of the Internet says that's the way we're going. So that's kind of the current course and speed that the Internet is on, actually. So once, there already is widespread recognition that passwords aren't enough. And so web services are racing to figure out how they can actually shore up their consumer access strategies. So many websites are, in fact, running to 2FA solutions. I don't think that's going to be truly scalable for the same reason not every merchant on the planet issues credit cards, because that's not very scalable. I don't think it's going to be scalable for every web service on the planet to start rolling out 2FA. And so I do think there'll be some consolidation. Users are going to have primary access points and use that to get to secondary access points. It's not to say that secondary access points are less valuable. It's just that users don't go there quite as often. So like with my bank, I can have a credit card and you can have your credit card. We can both get the same set of web merchants to access services. We think that kind of model makes a lot of sense here. But the first thing that has to happen is that the web services today must do something to shore up their authentication. And so some element of either deploying MFA directly or partnering with somebody who does is the right answer.
Okay, you may have you touched a little bit on this, but could you maybe expand on, would two-factor authentication continue to be optional?
That's interesting, actually. I have my own experience with this, is that and there's 2 websites that I use. I lost my phone recently. It wasn't working, and so I had to enroll a new phone. And so I had this problem, is that my primary authenticator, my phone, was the 2FA thing, and I didn't have it anymore. And so today, web services will allow you to basically go in and turn it off. So you can turn off the strong thing. And to me, that's kind of defeats the whole purpose, because that's what the crook's going to do if they're trying to get access to my account. So I think long term, all web services are going to make this mandatory. But long term, I don't think every web service will do it directly. They'll either do it directly or they'll partner with somebody who's done it already and piggyback on that thing the consumer has already.
Great. Could you talk a little bit about authentication standards?
So I touched on this in my talk. The problem is today is there are no standards, and what we can't have is every web service on the planet is trying to dream up some new multi-factor authentication solutions, because from a user point of view, this is just unmanageable. And so there has been recent activity in Europe to actually legislate and mandate authentication standards. So much the same way we have with cars, we always have the driver's steering wheel in the same place and the turn signal in the same place and brake and gas pedal in the same place. There is a move to trying to normalize how consumers get access to services, and so that makes me hopeful that some of this noise and friction from a user point of view is going to get solved, but we're not there yet.
Okay. What can I do to protect myself?
I don't have a long list of things to say here, but the first thing I would say is that at your primary websites, the ones that you use a lot and have more sensitive data about you, I would encourage you today to turn on whatever multi-factor solution that they have available to you. So the big web properties do this already. Evernote and LinkedIn and Apple and Google all have multi-factor authentication. So I think that's a good thing. You should definitely be turning that thing on to protect yourself a little bit better. Not every web service does it today, so if you're another strategy to deal with the way the Internet works today is to get to using some sort of password manager as a mechanism to make sure you can have unique passwords in your life, recognizing that that's only a near-term solution. Longer term, we're going to have to do something better, but those are 2 things you can do today to make yourself safer.
Great. Okay, thank you. I think that's it from a question perspective. Did you have any final thoughts before we wrapped up?
No, I want to thank everybody for taking time to listen to what we have to say today. If you are interested in our approach and how we think this model needs to roll out, we would definitely encourage you to come and talk to us, and definitely interested in having more conversation in future. And we do have some related topics that we'll be presenting in future, so I encourage you to come back and listen to those as well. So thanks for doing this today, Sarah.
Great. Thanks so much, Andre. So as Andre mentioned, you can visit us at securekey.com/connect. The website's up on the screen right now. In addition, this webinar will be available on demand at any time on our website to replay in the future, and you'll also be receiving a copy of Andre's presentation slides from today. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and have a great day.
Thanks, all.